days before the 34th anniversary of the Lockerbie bombing, a Libyan man accused by the United States of being the bomb maker has been taken into US custody. 270 people died when a Pan Am flight exploded over the Scottish borders just before Christmas 1988. As our North America Sarah Smith reports, the suspect is expected to appear in a US federal court tomorrow.
Just a few days before Christmas in 1988, the town of Lockerbie was suddenly engulfed in flame. Pan Am Flight 103 was flying from Heathrow to New York when over southwest Scotland, a massive explosion in the cargo hold brought it down in seconds. All 259 passengers and crew died, most of them American, as did 11 others when wreckage fell on their homes. It remains the most deadly terrorist attack in British history. This is the man the US authorities accuse of making the bomb, Abu Agila Masood, seen here in Libya where he had been jailed for unrelated crimes. 2 years ago, the US Attorney General formally charged Masood with making the device which brought down Flight 103. The American and the Scottish authorities have always stressed that they would never stop trying to bring other people to justice. It was 5 years ago that the FBI learned that Abu Agila Masood had confessed to a Libyan official that he had built the Lockerbie bomb. Now, he's finally been arrested and is being extradited to the United States. Rick Manetti died on the plane. His sister, Kheir Weiss, welcomes the prospect of a court case in the US.
To know now that one of those who's involved in the bombing is coming to the US to stand trial and face justice through our legal system, I think that it is something that we have been fighting for over 3 decades. So I think there is a sense of finally justice for our loved ones.
The only man to have been convicted of the Lockerbie bombing, Abdelbaset Al-Megrahi, was jailed in 2001, but released 8 years later and allowed to return home to Libya because he was dying of cancer. Some of the victims' families still have doubts about his conviction and about the arrest of Masood.
Fills my mind with questions, really. First of all, why is it taking so long? Secondly, what's he doing in America? This was a crime committed on above Scottish soil, but which came to land on Scottish soil. Therefore, it's the responsibility of the Scottish legal system.
With the prospect of a new trial looming, the 34th anniversary of the bombing will be commemorated quietly in Lockerbie in a few days' time. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Washington.
And let's go to Lockerbie now because our Scotland correspondent Alexandra Mackenzie is there. And it is poignant timing, Alexandra, with the anniversary just days away.
It absolutely is. Many people here in Lockerbie still vividly remember that night. It was just days before Christmas, almost 34 years ago. Many people would have been flying home for Christmas. Now some of the relatives come back here to Lockerbie to visit that memorial. Some of the victims were from the UK and 11 people died here on the ground in Lockerbie. Now, some of the UK families don't believe that Libya was involved. They don't believe that Megrahi was guilty, and they do not want to see a trial on American soil. So for some of those UK families, yes, this is a development today, but not one that they believe is going to bring the closure that they've been seeking for many years.
Alexandra, thank you.
Welcome to the Pan Am Podcast, brought to you by the Pan Am Museum in Garden City, New York. My name is Tom Betty, and I'm the host of this program. Thank you for joining us. You just heard a breaking news story from BBC News on December 11th, 2022, announcing the capture of the suspected bomb maker of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie almost 34 years to the day of the bombing in 1988. In this episode, we are joined by two distinguished guests, Fred Burton and Mark Zaid, and we'll be discussing counterterrorism, the intelligence community, the Lockerbie investigation spanning more than 3 decades, and the quest for American justice. Due to the sensitivity of these topics, listener discretion is advised. Fred Burton is a former police officer, special agent for the Diplomatic Security Service of the U.S. State Department, and a New York Times bestselling author. He served on the front lines of high-profile investigations, like the attempted hijacking of Pan Am Flight 73 in Karachi, Pakistan in 1986, the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, the hunt for and arrest of the mastermind behind the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, the 1988 plane crash that killed a U.S. ambassador and the president of Pakistan, and the search for Americans kidnapped by Hezbollah in Beirut, Lebanon. His best-selling books include his personal memoir, Ghost, Confessions of a Counterterrorism Agent, and his other books, Chasing Shadows, a special agent's lifelong hunt to bring a Cold War assassin to justice, Under Fire, the untold story of the attack in Benghazi, and his fourth book, Beirut Rules, the murder of a CIA station chief and Hezbollah's war against America. There are links to purchase these books in the episode description. Fred also consults with Fortune 500 companies on security development and how to keep their personnel and business safe as the executive director of the ONTIC Center for Protective Intelligence. He was selected by Security Magazine as one of the most influential people in security in 2021, and his nonfiction books have been featured in fictional thrillers by Brad Thor, Jack Carr, and Tom Clancy's Target Acquired by Don Bentley. Fred's website is officialfredburton.com. There is a link in the episode description. Mark Zaid is an American attorney based in Washington, D.C., with a practice focused on national security law, freedom of information constitutional claims, and government accountability. Many of his cases are very well known, such as suing Libya for the 1988 terrorist bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, which resulted in a $2.7 billion settlement, the largest of its kind against a foreign government for terrorist activities. Mark often represents former and current federal employees, intelligence and military officers, whistleblowers, and others who have grievances or have been wronged by agencies of the United States government or by foreign governments. He also regularly represents members of the media. Mark teaches the D.C. Bar continuing legal education classes on defending security clearances and the basics of filing and litigating Freedom of Information Privacy Act requests. He has been named as a Washington, D.C. super lawyer every year since he was profiled in 2009, as well as Best Lawyer by Washingtonian Magazine in 2009, 2011, 2013, and 2015. Issued biannually for his national security work. As the National Law Journal once wrote, if Agent Mulder of the TV show The X-Files ever needed a lawyer, Zaid would be his man. Mark's website is markzaid.com. There is a link in the episode description. At the time of this recording, we do not know the specifics or how long the federal trial of the accused suspect will be within the American justice system. However, Fred, Mark, and I will be providing brief updates through this program throughout 2023 in the form of special short consolidated news briefs as new information develops. Although this topic is extremely painful to the victims' families and everyone within the Pan Am community and beyond, the upcoming trial has great historical significance and should be chronicled for education and posterity by this program. Make sure you are subscribed to this podcast so that you will be alerted to these special installments. Now on to our interview with Fred Burton and Mark Zaid. It's a great honor to welcome you to the Pan Am podcast, Fred and Mark.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you.
So let's talk about your backgrounds and this interesting field that both of you have been in for some time. Fred, why don't we talk about you first? Let's go back to when you were 16 years old.
Well, first, thank you so much, Tom, for giving me the opportunity to talk today on the Pan Am podcast. First, I grew up in the Bethesda Chevy Chase area, which is right on the district line in many ways, very close to where Mark operates out of. And when I was a kid, I had a neighbor who turned out to be a very senior Israeli military officer. In fact, the air attaché that was gunned down and murdered by a group that I would subsequently learn to be the Black September organization. This was the same group that was responsible for the Munich massacre in '72 at the Olympics. And as a result of that, I joined our local rescue squad when I was 17, as soon as I could, and they were the same group that transported Colonel Alon that was murdered that night to Suburban Hospital in Bethesda. And then I became a Montgomery County, Maryland police officer where Colonel Alon was killed. And then I had a wise old sergeant that encouraged me to apply to the federal government. So I was fortunate enough to get a job with the State Department in the 80s. And I went out right out of basic agent training to be a special agent assigned to our counterterrorism division, where I would spend the next, I believe it was 15 years doing nothing but counterterrorism work.
And Mark, how did you get into this interesting profession?
So I grew up on Long Island in the New York City region, and my formative years were in the 70s and 80s as international terrorism, especially against the United States, really picked up. So I vividly remember the morning of the Beirut bombings of the embassy and the Marine barracks. I vividly remember Mr. Leon Klinghoffer being murdered by the PLO in 1985. And then I was in college in 1988, actually first studying abroad in London in the spring of 88, came back for my senior year in the fall of 88. And of course, that is when Pan Am 103 was bombed on December 21st, 1988. Two of my schoolmates were on board the flight. They were on the fall study abroad program in London. And coming from Long Island, there was somebody from my hometown, and there were many other connections. So I was very motivated then going into law school of trying to work on terrorism issues, war crimes. My grandfather was a soldier and chaplain with the U.S. Army, liberated Dachau. So all of human rights work was really motivating me as I entered law school in 1989. And the Pan Am 103 case became really center up in the forefront for shaping what is now a 30-plus year legal career.
Let's talk a little bit about the Lockerbie case. So we have covered terrorism on this program in a variety of different episodes. The first one was episode 6 about the 1970 hijacking of 4 aircraft. In the 1960s, it was almost a novelty to be on a hijacked aircraft going to Cuba. The majority of the hijackings in the 1960s. Something changed in the 1970s, and then it continued to change and become more and more dangerous in the 1980s. Let's talk a little bit about counterterrorism and terrorism in the 1980s as it pertains to aviation, and then we can talk about Lockerbie.
Sure, I'd be happy to kick things off if you like, Tom. I think it's important from a historical perspective as a student of global security and terrorism for context. If you look at the time of the bombing of Lockerbie, we still had the wall up with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was still in Afghanistan. In fact, it was the largest covert operation that the CIA had underway since Vietnam underway in Afghanistan. And then we literally had the world on fire on my watch. In 1986, we had the Libyans that bombed the Labelle Disco in Germany, followed up by 2 attacks that probably a lot of people aren't familiar with, were 2 of my cases, which was the attempted Libyan assassination of our staff in Khartoum, the Sudan, and Sana'a. And as a result of Labelle and Khartoum and Sana'a, President Reagan decided to strike Tripoli with a bombing. And then you fast forward to 1988 time period, you had the horrific USS Vincennes, U.S. Navy vessel that shot down the Iranian Airbus, Iran Air 655, which killed 290, if memory serves me right. And then Also in October of 1988, you had the Germans raid a series of safe houses in what was called Autumn Leaves, which resulted in a bunch of Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command roll-up of terror cells, which led to the seizure of improvised explosive devices and to include even a Pan Am flight schedule. And then as you look at 1 week or 2 weeks, I think it was actually about 10 days before the bombing of Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, you had the anonymous phone call to the U.S. Embassy in Helsinki claiming that the Abu Nidal organization was going to bomb a Pan Am flight. So in the backdrop of this as well, Tom and Mark, we had lived through the horrific embassy bombings that Mark alluded to in Beirut caused by Hezbollah, which was Iranian-backed, in 1983 and in 1984. We had the Marine barracks bombing. We had the U.S. Embassy bombing in Kuwait. And then we had the kidnapping of the CIA station chief in Lebanon, which was another one of my cases. So we literally were running all over the world, almost as like smoke jumpers, just doing the best we could to investigate these acts of terror. But there wasn't a lot of prevention. There wasn't a lot of proactive work on any of our part. We were just simply, in many ways, flying Pan Am around the world, taking us to these locations just to investigate these attacks and moving on, or just waiting for the other one to drop.
And Mark, what is your perspective?
Yeah, so ironically, I can probably for another show talk to you about the D.B. Cooper skyjacking, because I was the lawyer on the cold case team that identified an individual as being D.B. Cooper. And I've been litigating against the FBI now for 7 years to secure the release of all the D.B. Cooper files. And of course, that was one of the earlier American hijackings in 1971. We just passed 50 plus years of that. And unexpected, as Fred has said, we react to events that happen rather than prepare for them, unfortunately. So, during our lifetime, if you think of all the incidents that have happened involving aircraft and then the changes that happened as a result, one that jumps to my mind the most is, why do we take our sneakers and shoes off before we get on board the plane? Thanks to the one guy who tried to light his explosives in his shoe as the sneaker bomber. And as many things happen, most of my work is dealing with the U.S. government and representing intelligence officials and military and law enforcement who work for the federal government. And our government, as good as it is with so many things, is horrible in dealing with problems. It uses a sledgehammer approach rather than laser precision, which is why we all take our shoes off, even though only one guy at least that I know of in the known history, has tried to use some sort of sneaker explosive device that obviously failed, thankfully. But look, aviation is, we wonder, aviation is one of the safest modes of transportation, obviously, at least in the major flights. Small planes crash all the time, and most of the time it's pilot error or some sort of it's not to do with the plane, it's the weather or whatever. But major airlines, like what we're talking about, 747, that's why when Pan Am went down, everybody who knew anything immediately jumped to the fact of, this had to have been intentional, because 747s just don't, and still don't, fall out of the sky. It's that secure a system. But when it does happen, the reality is hundreds of people die. So the story becomes much, much bigger than it does, even though I don't know what the latest stats are, but I remember 55,000 people a year die in car accidents, far, far in excess of exponentially who die in aviation related incidents. Yet we don't have anywhere close to the mandated safety requirements in roads and vehicles and things like that, because it only happens to 2 people here, 4 people here, 1 person here, 1 person there. And, it barely makes the news most of the time. So it's a very interesting history about aviation, and Pan Am in particular. obviously, given the history that airline has with aviation, I mean, basically dominating all of aviation history, and unfortunately, sadly, going down in the demise that it did.
And, I would like to just follow up one brief comment that Mark said that really struck me when he was going through what led him into this line of work. I'm sure if you talk to enough shrinks, they would go back to the incident that happened in my neighborhood when I was 16. But when Pan Am 103 crashed over Lockerbie, this was personal to us. We had our special agent colleagues on that flight that were coming home from Nicosia and Beirut. We had a senior justice official. We had a senior official from the DIA. And then we had a senior CIA officer on the flight whose brother was also a State Department special agent. So when that flight at 31,000 feet fell out of the sky, and this was a flight that I had been on, many of us had been on. Our diplomatic couriers had flown on it almost religiously. And quite frankly, I was a bit surprised that we did not have a courier go down on that flight, because it was just such a workhorse run for us coming home. And the timing and the sequence of this was horrific. I'll never forget the flash cables coming in that night as to the plane vanishing. And I think it's important, too, to understand that when this happened, we had no idea who was behind it. And as part of some of the work that I did on this case myself, I know that there's still a lot of mystery surrounding that. Regardless of the forensics and regardless of the evidence that I know Mark and we were always trained to follow, there's still a lot of unknowns. And I still have a lot of unanswered questions surrounding the case myself. So it's one of these kinds of horrific events that we should never forget. And again, this was the largest loss of American life by a terrorist attack before 9/11. And so we should never forget. And we should always remember the individuals who were on that flight, whether they were students from the University of Rochester or Syracuse University, or U.S. government personnel, or just citizens from all over the world just trying to come home for the holidays.
Mark, can you kind of walk us through what it was like to live in 1988 and experience this news, especially since you knew people on that flight?
So, not surprising to, I'm sure, your audience, Pan Am was pretty much where we all flew to go internationally, especially from an economic standpoint, because it had the greatest number of runs, so it was cheaper. And for the students, that's what we all flew back and forth. And because I was fortunate enough to have been on a study abroad program in the months before, I knew people who were also overseas on their programs in that fall. So I vividly remember the news when it was announced. Right, so the plane went down just after 2:00, probably, I think, hit the news no later than 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I was down in Florida because we were going on a cruise in the Caribbean. And I remember the news flashes that came across my grandmother's television that the plane had gone down. Now, they weren't necessarily speculating yet as to what brought it down. It was just that it confirmed that it had gone down. And I called Pan Am right away to try and to go through a list of names of friends of mine that I knew were overseas and coming back at least at some time around then. And whoever I spoke to handled it properly and did not confirm or deny. They couldn't reveal the privacy-related information as to who exactly was on this flight, which was ironic because one of the criticisms against Pan Am in the aftermath was that in reaching out to family members, sometimes whoever it was actually left answering machine messages that their loved one had died on board the plane. I mean, that's how inexperienced, I suppose, and insensitive, but inexperienced in particular, that they were in not knowing how to deal with this type of incident. In fact, Pan Am and the State Department went through tremendous amount of training, well, aviation in general, but government training as to how to deal with these types of incidents and notification. I was on the cruise then, and I remember stopping in Puerto Rico and picking up like a daily news, New York Daily News, New York Post, and there was an article about Eric and Jason Coker, who died on the plane. Jason was a student. They were twin brothers, 20 years old, juniors. And Jason was a student at Syracuse, and Eric was a student at University of Rochester, where I went. And I can still vividly feel what my stomach felt like, sort of like when you go on a roller coaster and you go really high and then you drop down really quickly. I mean, it was like a shot to the gut. I did not know Eric. I knew the other student, Kate Hollister. She was dating one of my fraternity brothers. And it was horrible. And then coming back home, and so we're still on break, until third week of January, give or take, and learning about other connections. And we had a memorial ceremony at my school the end of January, about the first week or so when we got back, and our chapel was packed, standing room only. And I remember actually the one student who brought most of us, or everyone, to tears was a classmate of mine who had been in London with me. And she didn't know either of the victims, but she talked about what no doubt they felt like in knowing they just had the most amazing experience of being overseas for months. And they're so looking forward to coming home from the holidays, and they bought all these presents for their family members. But at the same time, they know the next day they're going to hate the fact that they're back home, and they just want to go back over to Europe. And what that must have felt like, and that we came home and they didn't. And I'll still tear up as I think about that. I still have the memorial program from that actually on display in a cabinet downstairs in my home.
Fred, I know you talked about having colleagues on the aircraft. Let's talk about how you heard the news and what you were thinking and how you were feeling.
I vividly recall what happened. Of course, we had a 24/7 command post inside our building, and because I was in our counterterrorism branch, we were always notified whenever anything exploded in the world or any anomaly that occurred, because we were usually, we kept a bag packed to just be dispatched, either taking a civilian flight like Pan Am or TWA somewhere, or a U.S. Air Force Special Air Mission that would fly us to a location. And so our command center notified us and said that there's a Pan Am flight that's gone off the radar, missing, that came out of London Heathrow, and everybody was scrambling to figure out what happened to it. Now, most people don't realize that when these events unfolded, especially in 1988, in our command post, you had CNN, you had NPR and BBC, that open source media that you're listening to press reports. And we started to get notifications via what is called a flash message. Today everything's done via message, text, and email, but in those days we had cables, teletypes, if you can visualize those, that would come through literally our operations center. So we had flash messages that said that Pan Am 103 had gone down, and we were trying to get the manifest, but it looks like there was many U.S. government personnel that was manifested on the flight. And one of the things that there was a lot of scrambling to try to see in those days. Again, nobody carried cell phones. Everybody was working off pagers, Motorola pagers, which didn't work really internationally. And so we really were not sure who got on a flight and who didn't. So we were waiting on some data to come through Pan Am corporate. And one of the things that struck me, and still does, as very odd, and in fact I was laser fixated on this and went out and looked into this specifically, was that our U.S. ambassador to Lebanon, Andrew McCarthy, was scheduled to be on that flight. And we thought that he was on the plane. And then we learned that one of our agents out of Beirut was on the flight. And then one of our agents from Nicosia, Cyprus had been on the flight. And then, of course, we had the CIA officer out of Beirut and the DIA officer out of Beirut. And, you know, the psychology of this, it's hard to put it in a frame of reference. We had the CIA station chief kidnapped and missing in Beirut. We did not know where he was. We were looking for him. We had lost all these Marines in the bombing. We had lost all these CIA personnel in the embassy bombing. This was just another horrific, tragic event, again, that we felt overwhelmed with. That, oh my God, how could this be happening again? I think within, of course, none of us slept. We had family members waiting at Dulles Airport on connecting flights. They was going to meet some of our people, so you're scrambling around trying to confirm who was missing. And then we were doing notifications ourselves, actually sending agents out to houses and doing the knock on the door that nobody ever wants to do. And then I think the next day, or within 24 hours, I was off, looking into certain aspects of the plane crash to try to figure out if the reason that aircraft was targeted was because our personnel were on that flight. Again, to the backdrop of what had taken place, we had the USS Vincennes shoot down the Iranian Airbus. We had the retaliation attack on Tripoli by the U.S. government. So was this an effort to target Americans and personally target our people because we had agents and intelligence personnel on that flight? And did someone learn that the U.S. ambassador was slated to be on that flight?
That's just one of several where the thought was that specific individuals on the flight were targeted. And Fred mentioned one of the CIA officers. There are actually 5 that we know of that were on board. And, of course, Tiny McKee, an Army intel officer, was they call him Tiny because he was like 6'5" or something like that. He was a huge guy. He was doing work, in particular, trying to find our hostages over in the Middle East. And there was one theory that maybe he was targeted. And of course, there were theories about, Fred mentioned couriers, about couriers that were on board the flight that used Pan Am. And one theory was whether or not there were some drug couriers that were on board the flight. And it turned out not to be the case, although sometimes there were drug couriers that were being used by the DEA for purposes of law enforcement. But that led to a bunch of targeting. People had to look at some of the students. And one of the favorites of some of the Arab terrorists were to befriend American students, particularly females, and say, can you bring a gift to my friend back home in Brooklyn, wherever? And that turned out to be a bomb. And again, you think about the notion of how do things change? Why is it that we were asked for so many years, did you pack your own bags? That was why we were asked, did you pack your own bags? Because that was a known exploitative mechanism to get an explosive on board without being detected. So there were lots and lots of theories that had to be looked at for the Pan Am 103 case and others, and those are just some of them.
And one of the points, too, that Tom, that I think just for your listening audience to understand, the flight debris, because of the wind patterns, was blasted over an 81-mile corridor, or 845 square miles. And think of that in concept. You're looking at crime scenes usually that might be in a house. Then look at this in an 845-mile kind of spectrum. And by the grace of God, if there has to be any saving grace with this, it exploded over land. In that, although people were killed on the ground, 11 personnel, which was horrible, if that had exploded over the North Atlantic, which I'm convinced that was the original plan, I'm not so sure we had ever figured out what had happened or recovered any forensic evidence whatsoever. Again, poor timing on the part of the bomb maker in many ways, but it turned out to be very fortuitous to us over time because we were able to uncover evidence of who might have carried out the attack, just because of the diligent effort predominantly of the Scottish, the British police, the FBI forensics, the CIA forensics, and just gumshoe detective work.
Let's talk about the aftermath. We really never talked about on this program before the aftermath, the motives, and how the intelligence and justice community brought and continue to bring those responsible to justice.
Sure, I'll start it off with some points. So, Fred mentioned earlier, I think on the recording, that at first, we really didn't know who it was. We knew it was a terrorist attack within days. I mean, once the explosive residue was detected, that sealed it, and that obviously didn't take long. So, I think even the news reports, literally within days, it was pretty clear that this is what had happened. Operation Autumn Leaves was initially suspected as to have been, and probably was, I think, realistically, the planned operation, but it was thwarted by the Germans. There was still, they recovered a bunch of Toshiba radio bombs, similar to the one that brought down Pan Am 103. Not identical. There was a difference between one speaker versus two speakers of the type of device, but it was very similar. And as far as I recall, and Fred can correct me if I'm remembering incorrectly, but one of the bombs that they suspected had been made, they never did find. And they don't know if that's the Pan Am 103 bomb or not, but it was certainly being looked at. And if you look at the books that came out prior to the two Libyan intelligence officers being indicted in November of 1991, they were all looking towards the PFLPG-PC, Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine General Command, which, if you thought the PLO was bad at the time in the 80s, these guys were far to the right of the PLO. These were the let's kill everybody type situation. And almost all of it, nobody that I know of, at least publicly, and Fred may have more information on the insides of stuff, but nobody was suggesting Libya. Nobody was thinking that. Everybody was thinking Iran because of Flight 65 shoot down on July 3rd of 1988, that this was retaliation for that. Maybe Abu Nidal in Syria and everything. And the books that were coming out prior to the 91 indictment were by counterterrorism experts like Steve Emerson, who has been a client of mine many years ago in Freedom of Information Act lawsuits, or journalists, British journalists predominantly, who were researching the case from that angle. And then it came publicly to me. I was involved with the families by this time, where I went to law school in Albany, New York. The region had 6 families who lost family members on board, and including Albany Law School family. Some of our alums had lost siblings on board the flight. And so I got to know the family members. I was doing programs at my law school, talking to the media about the case, what we could do. My work initially as a law student was how to sue terrorists and sue the countries as well as the terrorists as part of this prior to knowing it was Libya. And it was a shock to the public because we had no real indication that this was coming, that all of a sudden then I think he was Deputy Attorney, no, maybe he was Attorney General Barr, William Barr, announced on November 13th, I think, maybe it was 14th, 1991, simultaneously with the Scots, that boom, it was Libya that did it. That was quite shocking, and it changed the dynamics of everything. And I still think to this day, what would be interesting to go back to the books that came out prior to that to see where maybe they went wrong, if in fact it was Libya. And I know Fred and I both believe that it was Libya, and we can talk about the details of some of the case and some of the conspiracy theories as to why people still believe to this day that absolutely it was not Libya. Libya is a fake victim, a false victim. But I don't think that's true, and we can go into the details as to why.
Yeah, I think Mark did a very good job of summing up how we got here, towards the Libyan angle. And, the forensics were amazing. There was a very strong forensic tie to the Libyan government, which surfaced as a result of a piece of a circuit board that was stuck to a scorched shirt that turned out to be a timer that was only sold to the Libyan government. And then if you fast forward through the course of the Scottish trial and the recent apprehension or rendition, however you want to view it, of the bomb maker that was brought to U.S. custody, he claimed that he was called to Libyan headquarters, instructed to manufacture the bomb, transported that to Malta. We always knew we had a Malta nexus, and a piece of luggage, a Samsonite, got entered into Malta, actually handed it to a Libyan intelligence agent that happened to work for Libyan Airlines, and he was able to circumvent the baggage screening, and that's how it entered into the process. So ultimately, Gaddafi would pay restitution, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, although he never publicly admitted that he actually gave the green light to do this. So the bomb maker, as this trial starts to come out, I think it's going to be very enlightening as to exactly what he knows, who he spoke to, the circumstances and the facts, because I think in like all of these kinds of cases, facts matter. And although certainly the Iranians had motive for doing this, certainly the PFLP, GC, and all your radical Palestinian terrorist groups during that time frame certainly had motive. At the end of the day, I think you really have to follow the evidence to who was responsible for this. So I'm really intrigued to watch what's coming out in the upcoming trial.
Mark, you had mentioned there were other bombs that were intercepted and captured. Do we think, and this is just conjecture at this point, do we think that this bomb maker also made those?
I'm not sure if we know. And of course, the problem with some of this is I too, like Fred, I am optimistic, or at least, I don't know if I want to say optimistic, because I don't, from a legal standpoint, I am hopeful. That would be the better word. I am really hopeful we learn more information from this case, at least from the standpoint of the U.S. government introducing the evidence. But at the end of the day, if Masood, the individual, doesn't take the stand, we may not learn much more than what we already know. I mean, that was the case in the Camp Zeiss prosecution of Al-Marimi and Fima, the two Libyan intelligence officers. We really didn't learn a hell of a lot more from the original indictment in 1991 from what the trial was, because neither of them took the stand. We learned a bunch more about a defector who worked with them in Malta, and which also we knew about before the case, or at least before the trial. And there were certainly things that were filled in, but we'll have to wait and see. And in my view now with this case, I think this is going to be the case that either continues the investigation towards higher ups in Libya who are still around, like Senussi, who was the intel chief and is in somewhere supposedly in a Libyan prison. There are other senior Libyan officers who escaped in the aftermath of Gaddafi's overthrow in 2011, who were even in the hands of the British, but let go for some reason. But if we convict him based on the evidence, I think the case might still continue. If he's acquitted, even if he's guilty or not, I have a feeling that's going to be the end of the case. And if we go through, I know Fred and I are of a like mind of a lot of the evidence. And I've dealt with lots of conspiracy theories overall. I mean, I've litigated the Lincoln assassination, the Kennedy assassination. I represented Mohammad Al-Fayed, whose son Dodi was killed with Princess Diana. And I litigated that case as to who killed Princess Diana or why did she die. The D.B. Cooper case, like I said, lots and lots of conspiracy cases, you name it, and I deal with the intelligence community. There are always going to be issues with evidence when you look at it under a microscope. And there are going to be cracks and holes and sometimes even gaps. I'm an Occam's razor type of believer. The simplest explanation is the best. So that, yeah, Iran had a motive. Absolutely. It had the means by which to complete this incident or attack as well. But did it? Show me the evidence. I am still not aware of any actual evidence that shows that Iran put this bomb on the plane. All the evidence we know of is that it was Libya. And even though there are cracks in the eyewitness testimony, of which that is to be expected, anyone who studies eyewitness testimony knows how fallible it is. And anyone who lived through the O.J. Simpson case, you tell me, do you think O.J. Simpson murdered his ex-wife and her friend, even though he was acquitted? Because they dove down and shown the cracks in the case, right? If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. Well, there was a reason why the glove didn't fit. And it had nothing to do with whether or not O.J. Simpson murdered his ex-wife or not. And we have to look at the Pan Am 103 case in that way too. So the naysayers that I see all the time, who still exist to this day, I say to them, show me who else then perpetrated this bombing other than Libya.
It's a very simplistic question that I'm sure the answer to this question is complicated. But what was the motive of this terrorist attack, in your opinions? Fred, why don't we start with you?
It's a good question. I think when you start examining the facts as I understand it and from working aspects of the case, I think it makes very logical sense that Gaddafi, air quotes Gaddafi, the Libyan intelligence service, wanted to get even for our U.S. strike on Tripoli. Having said that, Libya certainly had a lot of evidence for their Bell disco bombing and two of my cases in Khartoum and Sana'a, which we knew directly were Libyan involved. So they kind of brought it upon themselves when President Reagan decided to conduct that airstrike. So, like Mark, I've always been one to stick to the facts and follow the evidence, and the truth will usually come to light. The problem with the intelligence community, having lived in that world too, Tom, and Mark knows this definitively as well, is the intelligence community's job is to produce information, intelligence, push it out to the community. So when you have an event like this that is so catastrophic, you have foreign liaison services reporting information. You've got walk-ins, you've got cranks, you've got speculation, you've got media, and it becomes overwhelming, and it's hard at times to stay on that path of just the forensics and the evidence, and where does that lead you? So motive, certainly the Libyans had enough of it. Having said that, I still wonder in my own mind, and maybe this is a failure on my investigative part from 1988, I still worry about whether or not someone, whether it was the Libyans or whoever else, knew that the president's representative to Lebanon was scheduled to be on that flight, in light of all the carnage that had happened in Beirut during that window of time. The two embassy bombings, the kidnapping of our CIA station chief, which, let me say this, let me pause this and say, if that happened today in our social media world, it would be like Benghazi on steroids, and I wrote a book about Benghazi. If you had a CIA station chief kidnapped and was missing, you can't understand how volatile that would have been in the intelligence community. So I learned a long time ago that at times things just simply don't make a lot of sense when Beirut's involved.
And to follow up to your point, the intelligence community is in a pretty difficult position because really the general public only knows of their failures. They don't know about the successes, because by definition, if it's a successful intelligence operation, then nobody knows about it. Correct?
For the most part, that's correct. You look at this handover or rendition or fugitive transfer of the bomb maker from Libya to the U.S., it's still very murky as to how he came into U.S. custody. I personally want to believe that the Rewards for Justice ran by my old department has a hand in this, that we got to the right people who decided to just hand this guy over. Maybe as low-hanging fruit to protect the higher-ranking Libyan intelligence official that's still languishing allegedly in a Libyan jail. He would be the big fish, the Al Capone, to be able to tell us definitively exactly what happened, provided he would cooperate.
Mark, let's get back to that question of motive. In your opinion, what do you think the motive is for this terrorist attack on Pan Am Flight 103?
No, I agree with Fred. The theory has always been this was retaliation for the bombing of Tripoli, of which supposedly Gaddafi's adopted daughter was killed, a 2 or 3 year old young girl. Look, we had barely any relations with Libya at the time. Libya was never a very important part publicly of our foreign policy. You know, there is a long history, the Barbary pirates going back to Thomas Jefferson, and in our song, the shores of Tripoli with the Marines, right? That's all Libya. I don't think most people probably even realize that's actually Libya. But Libya was never really on the radar for the most part. But there was a lot going on, and Libya and Gaddafi, who came into power in 1969, it's an incredibly rich oil and gas country. But we did not get our oil and gas mostly from there. It was the French and the Italians who did. So it wasn't as important in our world. So that even during, the gas crisis that I remember in 79 with long lines, you didn't really hear much about Libya. The only thing I remember about Libya as a kid was Billy Carter. President Carter's brother was stupidly got in trouble with some business endeavors with Libya, and I'm sure most people were scratching their head as to where the heck is Libya. But it's undoubtedly that's always been thought to be the motive, and you look at still what the evidence is. I went to Malta in 1994, so a few years after the bombing, and I walked the route and traced where the clothing from the suitcase, which was all forensic. Fred mentioned, they identified which suitcase, which was an unaccompanied suitcase, which is also why everybody has to keep their bags with them post 1988 before it went in, why no unaccompanied bags are allowed, supposedly, hopefully, on any flights because of this reason. And they identified which suitcase. It took them a while because at first they misidentified suitcases, and they identified some students as having been potentially the mule of having brought the bomb on board, which was horrific for the families. It turned out that their suitcases were on top of or next to the actual bomb suitcase, and they recovered the clothing from the suitcase that hadn't destroyed, and it had tags, Yorkie Clothing Company, which is a clothing company in Malta, which identified, those were our stuff. And then they figured out where it was sold from Mary's house. And I remember going to Mary's house and talking to Gauchi, who was the individual. He didn't know who the hell I was. I was already representing the families at that time, but I just said I was an American visiting Malta. And it's right down the street from the Libyan consulate / embassy. I'm not sure what the status of it was legally at the time. And they engaged with Libyans all the time, because if you ever go to this location, it's their equivalent of like Fifth Avenue in New York City. But this is the cheap store on Fifth Avenue. This isn't where people go for Tiffany's and stuff like that. So the Libyans always went to Mary's house to buy stuff. So they were very familiar with Libyans. And so it all shaped up as you looked at the evidence to point to Libya. And I kind of go back to what I said before. Motive is always important, but we still don't know why and I'll say it, why Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy. We still don't know the motive, for that. We don't know the motive of the guy in Vegas who killed like 60 people. There are a lot of times where we do not learn motive. It would be helpful. We know why Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols blew up Oklahoma City in 95. That helped lead to further evidence. But sometimes we don't know motive, so you go based on what the evidence is. And the forensic evidence, unless you want to claim, as some do, that it was faked or that, the CIA planted it, yeah, I mean, good luck with making those types of arguments, because you still got to show something to the contrary as to what might have led or would take the place of that evidence. And I've yet to see it, and I'm more than willing to accept alternative evidence if you give it to me to take a look at, but it usually isn't there.
You know what just occurred to me? So, Fred, you were heavily involved with many investigations. Pan Am Flight 73 that was hijacked in Karachi that we covered on this program earlier, Pan Am Flight 103. And it just occurred to me that Mark and Fred, both of you, for the last 34 years, your lives intersected.
Oh, for
correct?
sure.
Yeah, well, and I guess for indication, I'm trying to think what word it would be to say. I have been Fred's lawyer for I don't know how many years. In once he was retired for helping get his books through pre-publication classification review, which is one of the things that I do for folks. But Fred and I had not interacted during the course of your federal career, as I recall. I'm pretty sure we met after you retired, right?
My memory is better than yours, Mark. I will share that. Remember, my office ran the Rewards for Justice program, and your efforts in getting that public-private partnership to help us up the reward for primarily the bombers behind the bombing of Pan Am 103 was our motive. I'll give you a little inside baseball for your listeners, Tom and Mark. I don't know if you probably remember this, but we had always set at that time period the maximum reward offer, which was the $20 million for bin Laden. At the time on my watch, it was $2 million was the maximum reward. And in our eyes, we were going to pay the person that gave us information to the individuals responsible for the bombing of Pan Am 103 that maximum reward. We were going to hold that so that person would get that reward. And I'm highly optimistic. I want to believe, and probably the truth will be coming out maybe within our lifetime, that the latest handover of the bomb maker, that our old program had something to do with that somebody got paid a reward because, again, this is one of the programs that operates in the shadows. I used it for the apprehension of Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the first World Trade Center bombing, and many others. And so I would like to think that played a part in this in some manner, and we'll probably know that within the next 20 years.
Yeah, well, and relevant to your audience, Tom. So, in fact, what Fred's referencing, my first Pan Am 103 client was a man named Bruce Smith, and Bruce was a pilot for Pan Am, a career pilot. He flew international routes. His wife, Ingrid, was on board the flight. Bruce obviously was not. He was already back in the States, and his wife, Ingrid, who was British, was coming back from London area to come be with Bruce for the holidays, and unfortunately passed away as a result of being murdered. Bruce, because he was a Pan Am pilot, was well aware that with all the screw-ups that, frankly, Pan Am did commit surrounding this incident, which we can talk about if you want, nonetheless, there were no airlines probably, other than El Al, perhaps, at the time, that would have prevented this bomb from getting on board the plane other than by just pure sheer luck. But in a normal day, certainly any other American airline, even without the screw-ups that Pan Am committed, the bomb still would have been on board. So Bruce was one of only two that I know of the families who accepted the insurance company's settlement offer of $100,000. Old-timers like Fred and I will remember back in the day with the Warsaw Convention, when you flew international and you looked at the back of your paper ticket, it said the max you can receive by convention was $250,000 unless gross negligence could be presented, which is incredibly hard to do, although it was ultimately done in the Pan Am 103 case against Pan Am. But Bruce accepted a $100,000 offer, and because he wanted to go after the terrorists, he was hoping to get 9 other family members to do the same so he could post a $2 million, literally dead or alive, reward for those who committed it. Again, not knowing who did at the time, not knowing the country, not knowing the individuals. He was unable to do that because, unfortunately, the aviation lawyers, American, who sued Pan Am within days, as I recall, certainly within weeks, put forth the propaganda that this is all Pan Am's fault. Hook, line, and sinker. Pan Am, Pan Am, Pan Am. The families hated Pan Am because they associated Pan Am with having killed their loved ones. Weren't thinking about the fact that someone else put a bomb on the plane, and in fact, Pan Am lost 16 of its own family members, who were part of the crew. 243 passengers, 16 crew, 11 in the town of Lockerbie, who died for 270 people. And so Bruce was a vilified enemy. I spent the first couple of years suing Libya from about 93 to 95, even 96, where we were the enemy to most of the other family members, even though we were trying to, frankly, help all the family members, because the other lawyers painted us as the enemy, as bad, frankly, as Libya. But Bruce took all of the money that he had to launch a campaign effort, and he got the Airline Pilots Association and the Air Transport Association to bolster the reward program that Fred mentioned, so that's why Al-Marimi and FEMA had a $4 million award for their capture from 1991 to 1999, when they were finally surrendered by Libya to be tried at Camp Zeist in the Netherlands under Scottish law.
Mark, let's go back to what you said about Pan Am making mistakes, and let's talk about that.
So, the 1980s was really the decade of terrorism against the United States internationally. We were being hit very often and very dramatically, and with pretty successful attacks, because even when, like I mentioned, Leon Klinghoffer killed in 1985, even though only one American, or one person, in fact, was killed in the Achille Lauro hijacking, that had a huge impact on Americans going on cruises for a while. So the terrorists knew how vulnerable we are, not just by the whole notion of how sensational it can be rather than the number of lives. And a quick aside, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda never thought they were going to bring down the World Trade Center. They just wanted to make a huge, big splash and just cause havoc. And just, wow, the towers came down, probably to their undoing, if one remembers the 1993 attack, which killed 6 people and didn't do much of anything because of where they tried to bring the structure down. It probably ended up being their undoing because it was so successful, it led to us destroying Al-Qaeda at the time and obviously ultimately killing bin Laden. So in 1985-86, where there were so many terrorist incidents involving aircraft, some of which Fred worked on, Pan Am had the extraordinary idea of promoting a safety program where they charged a $5 surcharge on all tickets to combat terrorism, that it would go into a special anti-terrorist, security budget. Pan Am took out lots of ads in newspapers and maybe in television, perhaps I don't recall. And it turned out that the $5 went into its general operating budget because they were having some financial troubles. They put on a presentation publicly of bomb-sniffing dogs, German shepherds walking around all these airports, wearing really cool sweaters that said bomb, whatever it said on it. And the only thing those dogs could sniff was the dog in front of it because they had no special training. It was all optics. They also ran into problems with the notion of once the warnings went out in November, December of '88 about the autumn leaves and be on the lookout for possible radio bombs or radio cassette players that did not work, by the way. So if you push the button, it wouldn't work because the mechanism was taken out to put the bomb in. So they sent out all these notices, and the Frankfurt staff of Pan Am, which was doing their own security, messed it all up, didn't check the luggage going through the metal, through the X-ray machines, and then one of the staff members retroactively post-dated, I guess, right? Made it look like they had received it prior to or something like that. I'm getting, I think, a little my fact wrong, but basically what they did was they screwed up. They knew of something. They didn't do anything about it, and then they tried to cover up the fact that they actually had tried to do something when they hadn't. There were all of these notions, all of those type of things that came out in the trial against Pan Am by the family members in the early 90s that led to Judge Platt in the Eastern District of New York, which is Long Island, which is the jurisdiction for JFK Airport, to rule that there had actually been gross negligence, and that's why Pan Am was actually found liable for the bombing of Pan Am 103 and had to pay hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars ultimately in settlements with the majority of families. There were only 3 trials, damage trials, that went through to the end, and then Pan Am, well, really its insurance company, because by this time Pan Am had ceased business because the Gulf War had, as I'm sure most of your listeners know, had pretty much put the death knell. I guess what they sold their international routes, I think, to Delta. Then there was some issue with the sale, and between Pan Am 103, the Gulf War, and the Delta sale, that was the end of Pan Am. So it was the insurance company actually that handled the rest of the case that went into 1995, 1996. But, a lot of lessons learned as to how Pan Am screwed it up. Now, whether or not that should have been gross negligence, I will say, I'm sure reasonable minds can differ. People were surprised that Judge Platt had actually ruled against Pan Am. That was not expected, I think, as I recall, by the legal community or certainly the aviation community. And that really did send a chilling message, obviously, to the aviation community, presumably and hopefully to come up with better security methods, or at least maybe the U.S. government to help create TSA in the aftermath with 9/11. But all of these are connected. I mean, anyone who does counterterrorism work or history of terrorist activities, you can't just look at 9/11 in the modern day and figure things out. All of these events are connected to one another in shaping how we handle aviation cases today.
And I would like to just add, Mark, and that was a very thorough explanation of what transpired, that the bombing of Pan Am 103 was a watershed moment in aviation security. Having lived through that at that time period, there's been certain aspects, usually every 10 years, whether you go back to the 60s, to where we had the UT sniper case at the University of Texas, which resulted in the creation of the University of Texas Police Department. And then you look at events like the Black September Munich massacre and other attacks. That creates a industry of international security managers. And Pan Am 103 did that. There was a tremendous uptick in the hiring of international security managers of multinational corporations and aviation security specifically, and a rush for technology to help us do a better job to screen for bombs going into the holds of aircraft. Look, in 1988, there was no guarantee that 100% of any bags going into an aircraft hold was being searched by anybody for a bomb. So that piece of luggage could very well have made its way into any number of holds during that time period, and we would have had the same result. In my mind, that was just the nature of the security industry in that space.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it wasn't up until TSA after 9/11 that the security of airlines and airports was solely the responsibility of the government. In 1988 and before, it was the responsibility of the airline, which in a aviation business perspective puts a disadvantage to American carriers because the foreign carriers such as British Airways, Lufthansa, Air France, Alitalia, for instance, they were all subsidized by their governments, which means that their governments took care of their security, correct?
That's correct. You had look, in the private sector security space, security is a cost center. It's not a profit center. Therefore, companies are always cutting costs when it comes to security operations. And when you step back into that time period, you still had people smoking on planes. I remember actually going out in the 88 crash and flying somewhere into Cyprus, I believe, and there was folks lighting up cigarettes on aircraft. That was just the nature of the time and space in the sector. And whether they screened my bag, I just don't remember. You were lucky to have somebody that was paying attention if there was an X-ray machine somewhere to hope that there was no bomb in that carry-on.
Anything else you'd like to add, gentlemen, especially about the families and the families' perspectives?
We just recently had the 34th anniversary of the bombing, and I went to the memorial ceremony, as I do every year at Arlington, where we've been since 1995, if I'm remembering correctly. There's a memorial cairn that's there. Actually, someone from the Pan Am family always puts a wreath to the flight crew that were lost in the bombing as well. And I will tell you, every year, I think I've only missed one ceremony in 30 or so years. And it's smaller every time. 34 years have gone by. A lot of the family members have passed away, at least the most immediate ones. I go there and there's mostly faces I don't recognize, many of whom weren't even born at the time. There's a lot more government personnel actually that outnumber family members, in fact, which is kind of interesting. But you never get over something like this. I mean, I've represented a lot of victims of terrorism over the years now, or just folks that have, for whatever reason, lost a loved one. And, it's been interesting to see how folks react differently if it's a child versus a parent versus a sibling versus a spouse. And because the average age on this flight was 27 years old, which meant, out of 270 people that were killed, let's put 259 as far as on the flight. That meant a vast majority of them were under the age of 21. They were kids. So the family members were mostly parents. And I know some of them, right, they never changed the room of their child. It was as if, they were just waiting for their kid to come home from winter break or studying abroad. Whereas others obviously moved on with their lives. If they lost their spouse, they remarried, etc. But you can never fill the void that this happens, especially when it's intentional. So to have this new criminal case, it's very emotional and overwhelming to many of the family members. And it invokes a different reaction from many of them. Some of them want nothing to do with it because it just reopens the wound that they've tried to at least cover up to some extent and move on. Whereas others, they're seized with it and they're going to go to all the court proceedings, or at least as many as they can. My role, even after all these years, even though we have no active litigation for anyone, and I'm not being paid by any clients or anything like that, but my goal is still to properly represent the families for the truth and full accountability. And, Fred mentioned Benghazi earlier. I represented several of the CIA officials who were there in Benghazi the day the ambassador was murdered. So if anyone saw the movie or read the book 13 Hours, those were my clients. I got that book cleared just in the way I get Fred's books cleared through classification review. The fact is, I remember asking my clients, who were CIA case officers and CIA essentially bodyguards, etc. So here you are operating in Benghazi in the year or so after Gaddafi had been overthrown. Were you making any efforts to find out more information about the bombing of Pan Am 103? Were you making any efforts to see where FEMA, not FEMA FEMA, but FEMA, Khalifa FEMA, one of the bombers, alleged bombers, he was acquitted. Do you know where he's located? Do you know where, I think Al-Marimi, I believe, was still, he might have just died. Do you know any additional information? Are you looking for evidence to find out? Are you looking to buy evidence in the way we did in the collapse of the Soviet Union when we bought tons of KGB files because the system had just collapsed around them and we went in as the CIA to just, and reporters did the same, to buy information. Were we doing any of that? And the answer every single time was no. I never heard the word Lockerbie of Pan Am 103 mentioned. So, people like Fred and I, who have not only a personal connection, but a professional one, we're here, in, at least as long as we still have breath in our bodies, to keep pushing forward on this case, to lock down either, as we believe Libya did it, or to find additional evidence that indicates anything else, but also to hold accountable anybody who participated in this bombing. And we'll see what happens, as we said earlier, with respect to Massoud being prosecuted here in the United States in D.C. over the course of probably the next 15 months.
And from my end, Tom, when you look at what happened during that time period, you certainly can't replace the loss of life, but you certainly can also never forget. I know my old organization, the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service, religiously attends these events. Our agents' names are on the law enforcement memorial, just like the CIA officers on the Hall of Honor at Langley headquarters. And I think, too, look, let's give a shout out to the Department of Justice and the FBI, no doubt, behind the scenes as well, that made an effort to bring this bomb maker back. I know how easily it would have been to just say, well, it's not worth the time and effort. We've got Ukraine going on. We've got the South China Sea. We've got never-ending COVID and just the general geopolitics of the world. But someone made an effort to bring this guy back to stand trial, and hopefully justice will be served, and he might be able to answer some of the missing pieces that we all still have surrounding this case. So I really applaud the Department of Justice for going the extra mile to make this happen.
Well, I would like to thank both of you. I know it's a difficult topic, complicated topic, and it's part of your life's work. So I definitely appreciate your time coming on the program. Any closing comments as we wrap up this episode?
Well, from my end, Tom, I would like to thank you and the Pan Am Museum for caring, for addressing a very difficult topic that obviously is near and dear to the hearts of many still, especially Pan Am. And thank you for covering some of these very difficult and challenging issues.
Yeah, I appreciate this time as well. I'll say even I have another connection, strangely enough, even it goes beyond this, but one of my good friends who I helped do a book with about the comic book world of all things, Mark Vaz, he wrote a book not too long ago about Pan Am at War, how the airline.
Oh yeah, with John
America
Hill.
fight World War II.
Yes.
Maybe you've had him on. I'm not sure if you have had him on.
Not yet, but
you should. I can connect you to him. But Mark and I have worked together on many things, and it was just a weird interaction of when you just think about small world type things. That he did this book on Pan Am. I mean, anyone who lived into the time of Pan Am's demise. I mean, Pan Am. That if you can't talk aviation history without talking Pan Am. And, if you want to talk about motive, just to kind of wrap it up, the whole reason why we all believed Pan Am itself was hit by whomever, and then turned out to be the Libyans, was because of the big American flag that it had on its tail fin. This wasn't an attack on Pan Am in order to put Pan Am out of business. It was an attack on America. And us, and Pan Am was representative of that, unfortunately. So I appreciate that you keep the memory alive of a great airline that has its ups and downs, but is really reflective of the history of aviation, not only in the United States but also the world.
Mm-hmm. And like Fred, what you've told me earlier, people point fingers. People blame the government. People blame, the airline, Pan Am. But really, the only person at the end of the day that we should be blaming is the people that carried out this attack.
From my eyes and where I sit, that's what I firmly believe. I hold the people responsible that put together this operation, decided to go the green light to carry it out and put that bomb on the aircraft. They're the ones that are responsible for this tragedy.
And hopefully we will see justice in the very near future. Again, thank you very much for your time, and Happy New Year, and we will have you back on the program.
Sounds great.
Thank you, Tom.